All right. Good evening. We'll go ahead and get started as people kind of start trickling in a little bit. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is the webinar on duck hunting strategies and techniques. So we're pretty excited about this one. Things are starting to get quite exciting in the wetlands. Obviously, migration is getting ready to start pushing down. Seasons are getting ready to open up. So it's a good time just to kind of reemphasize some of these different strategies and techniques that we can use while we're out in the field. A quick kind of overview of what we're going to discuss tonight during today's webinar. We're going to start off with a brief overview of duck and waterfowl ecology. And I know a lot of people may think, oh, that's kind of boring, it's not exciting, but one of the things I'm big on, especially with hunting, is if we can start to incorporate some of this animal behavior and some of this ecology into our hunt planning and into our strategic approach to hunting, we can offer we can often really bolster our success. And waterfowl is one of those species that it's really prominent. And we'll kind of tell a few stories as we kind of go through tonight's webinar, and Curtis will certainly highlight a few as well. But understanding duck ecology and how they feed, where they feed, and what they're feeding on, how they're using these different areas is really important. So we'll spend some time going over that, and then we'll talk about dabblers versus divers. We can essentially group ducks into two distinct groups. So you have your dabblers, which a lot of people also call puddle ducks. So these are ducks that like shallower bodies of water, smaller bodies of water, versus your divers who like a lot bigger bodies of water. And depending on which type of duck you're trying to target, you may be in a different habitat type, or you may use a different decoy spread. You may use some of these different strategical approaches, and so we'll discuss quite a few of those as we move through. Then we'll go over some decoy strategies and decoy placement. So we've got a few different charts that we can show and kind of go over how we like to tinker with our decoy spreads to make them seem a little bit more real, because that's one of the big things about waterfowl hunting. If you think about it, we're hunting migratory species. So by the time they come from the prairie pothole region up north in Canada and come down to Illinois, they've seen a lot of decoy spreads. They've seen what a lot of hunters typically use, and oftentimes mimicking that natural behavior. So like we'll talk about during the ecology, can really make your decoy spread look natural and be a little bit more enticing. After that, we'll talk about a few basic vocalizations with duck hunting, and when to use them and what they mean when we're communicating with these different animals. It's really important to understand what vocalization you're using and what you're trying to say with that vocalization. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a duck calling guide. So Curtis, we've got our duck calls ready. So we're going to go over some basic practicing techniques and some real basic introduction on how to utilize a duck call and how to make some of these vocalizations. But the bulk of that section will really be talking about the vocalizations, what they mean, when to use them, and how to use them. But before we get started too far, just some quick introductions. My name is Dan Stevens. We also have Curtis Twellman with us tonight. So Curtis, if you want to say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Perfect. Should be a fun night. So before we get started too far, we do have your microphones and webcams disabled for the webinar. It just kind of keeps things smooth and polished without too much interruption or background noise. So if you do have any questions as we kind of progress through this webinar, we do want to answer those as much as possible and as quick as possible. So below in the chat, you can find either a chat that'll allow you to talk amongst yourselves, talk amongst with us. You can ask questions that way. And there also is a Q&A feature that you may see on your screen where you can type in a question and we can either address it in the chat, or we can go ahead and bring it to the live presenter and they can kind of address it during their section. So please use the Q&A feature in the chat. We want this to be as engaging and as interesting as possible, and it certainly helps us kind of guide the conversation if you bring up any questions you may have. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll talk a little bit about waterfowl ecology. I kind of mentioned in the open how important this is for waterfowl hunting, not only for your hunt planning process, but also for your strategic approach. So we'll just kind of quickly go over waterfowl ecology. And I first want to start off by discussing migration. Waterfowl are a migratory species. That means they don't spend their entire life in Illinois. Now, we certainly do have some resident species like Canada goose. Mallards in some areas can be resident, but what we're really focusing on today is these migratory birds and this migratory population that's coming down. And essentially in North America, we have four distinct flyways. You can see in this map, we have the Atlantic, the Central, the Pacific, and then the Mississippi, which is the one Illinois falls under. So waterfowl again follow these natural migration routes, and obviously you can see there is some very, for lack of a better term, undefined boundaries. You can see there is a little bit of overlap. It does spatially basically cover the entirety of Illinois. But what these waterfowl, especially the migratory birds, are really following is that Mississippi River floodplain and following that Mississippi River Valley down as they reach the wintering grounds. So waterfowl by nature are an aquatic species. There are about 40 plus species of waterfowl in North America. There's about 22 species of waterfowl commonly found in Illinois. And of that, we have about 15 or 16 ducks that we quite commonly see. Now, with migratory species, there is no limit for what could show up, what species might show up. Every year, there's a couple rare sightings of like a long-tailed whistling duck in Illinois, or some of these other species that typically don't migrate through Illinois or follow along this Mississippi flyway. And that's what's cool about waterfowl. You never really know what's going to show up. I do also want to talk about the waterfowl banding program, and especially as you get more into waterfowl hunting, you'll notice one of the things that a lot of hunters target or kind of like to use as a quote unquote trophy is this waterfowl band program. And if you harvest a species, Curtis has got a few right there in his lanyard. And so you can see these are essentially identification tools that biologists can use to attach to the birds, and then they can watch where that bird is then essentially harvested. And so it gives them a really unique depiction of, okay, we banded this bird in northern Canada in 2004, and now it was harvested in southern Illinois in 2008. And so it tells a little bit about the life history of that bird, allows biologists and managers to kind of track these populations. But what I really want to highlight is how, if you look at this map here in the top right, this is basically waterfowl band recoveries. It's kind of a heat map. So the darker red you see, the more recoveries that area typically sees. And you can see Illinois sees a pretty good swath of recoveries, both along the Mississippi River, and you can also see the Illinois River starting to kind of shape there. If you can see my cursor a little bit, you can see that Illinois River as well as the Mississippi River is just chock full of band recoveries. And so this gives you a pretty good snapshot depiction of the migration pathway that these birds are taking. And I will say, if you do harvest a waterfowl that has a band, please go into the system and record that data. Again, it helps biologists, but what's really cool is they will send you a record of that bird. So I've got one from a wood duck a few years back that basically tells when it was first captured, when it was first leg collared or banded, and then the day I harvested it. And the one I harvested was only about a year between banding and harvest, but I know some cases, it can be 8 to 12 years depending on the specific bird. But pretty cool story. So just kind of make sure you do report that band if you do end up harvesting one. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about waterfowl ecology. And so there's several different habitat types that waterfowl will utilize throughout their life cycle. But what we're really going to be focused on today is obviously the fall and wintering behavior of waterfowl, because that's when we're really hunting them is obviously in these kind of fall winter months. So what they're going to be using a lot, just kind of a quick snapshot, is emergent wetlands, open water, bottomland forests, and crop fields. And so we'll first start off with these kind of emergent wetlands. This is what most people think when they think of wetland habitat or waterfowl habitat. These are essentially wetlands that have some form of vegetation emerging from the water. Pretty self-explanatory. This consists of marshes and swamps that can be inundated by seasonal or permanent water. And what's really interesting about ecology and how the land reacts to water, depending on the timing of that water, it can very much impact what plant vegetation and the herbaceous growth that's going to be coming up in that area. And so wildlife managers can actually use water draw off and being able to leave it on to control invasive species, but also to focus on getting a good germination in the seed bed, which is essentially in the ground where all these seeds are just kind of scattered and laying dormant until the conditions are right, and then they start growing. So emergent wetlands can be very productive. There's not a ton of wetlands in Illinois, especially emergent wetlands, which, if you think back to the natural history of Illinois, is pretty disheartening. because across much of this area, especially after the glaciation, which really just flattened this area, it was essentially a giant wet prairie. So we had a lot of wetlands. We had a lot of really productive wetlands. And obviously, as modern agriculture has drained a lot of these areas, converted them into ag, that's kind of what we're seeing now. So these emergent wetlands are very productive, but a little bit scarce and a little bit difficult to find, particularly in Illinois. But they provide an abundance of food. One, because they are so diverse, right? A lot of duck hunting you'll see if you're looking at YouTube videos or watching TV shows, they're in flooded cornfields. They're essentially buying and planting this kind of monoculture grain of really just one food source. But these natural emergent wetlands have species abundance, have diversity that offer food throughout that entire fall and winter, which can aid and provide a lot better opportunity for hunting as the waterfowl just kind of naturally use those areas over, a standard monoculture of corn. Now, certainly flooded corn is hard to beat, and if that's what you've got access to, I'm a little bit jealous. The next habitat type is open water. This is arguably my favorite type of waterfowl hunting. I haven't done a ton of it, and maybe that's why it's my favorite. Is just because it's kind of a rarity for me. I don't get a lot of opportunity to hunt over big bodies of water. But what's really neat about hunting some of these bigger bodies of water is it's going to open up the amount of species that you see. Like we kind of mentioned in the preamble, we have this concept of dabbling ducks versus diving ducks, and we'll kind of break out the distinctions between the two. But when you're hunting open water, you have a lot more likelihood of attracting diving ducks, but also puddle ducks or still the dabblers, because the dabblers will still use some of these bigger open bodies of water. They may just hang towards the shore or kind of back in the fringes, or they may find, the back of a shallow cove that, maybe 12 to 8 inches deep rather than, 15 or 18 feet. They really prefer that shallow water. But hunting open water can give you kind of that nice mix of, I might see some dabblers, I might see some divers, I might even see some coots or some mergansers. And so you have a lot of different opportunity for seeing different species. So these are often used again by dabbling ducks and diving ducks. Dabbling ducks will be feeding on kind of those fringe areas along the bank or in those shallow coves, like I mentioned, but they'll also be loafing. And we'll kind of discuss what loafing is in depth in a little bit, but essentially it's getting out in the sun and digesting their food. They've had their morning feeding. Now they're just kind of relaxing, saving caloric energy and starting to metabolize a lot of that food that they ingested in the morning. And so they often will use some of these bigger open bodies of water, even in the deep water. They just won't be actively feeding in there. They'll be kind of more loafing, as you can kind of see in this picture here. This illustrates a pretty good example of loafing. You can see none of those birds are reaching down trying to feed. They're all just kind of sitting there, relaxing, hopefully getting some sun, preening their feathers a little bit, cleaning off those oils and all that kind of stuff. So don't forget about deep open water, because it can be very productive. A little bit more difficult to hunt, and we'll go over some strategies that can help in a little bit, but open water can be quite productive. The next is bottomland forests, and if you ever have the chance to hunt a flooded forest for waterfowl, particularly if you get a bunch of mallards or wood ducks coming in, it can literally be I think the cream of the crop for waterfowl hunting. Just watching these birds as they come through the forest and just kind of cut back and forth. They're almost like little jet fighters, the way they can, just see those branches quickly maneuver out of the way before they just, really quickly drop in. It's just a sight to behold. But these bottomland forests can be either hardwood forest, which is typically what you'll find in Illinois. You'll find a lot of these areas will have pin oak or some of these oaks that have a little bit of a smaller acorn that waterfowl can ingest. And these flooded areas are excellent, excellent, excellent. Unfortunately, I would say this is probably even less abundant in Illinois as opposed to the emergent wetlands. Just not something that's completely available. And last but not least, we have crop fields, which is very, very, very abundant in Illinois. And this is one habitat type that a lot of people, especially when you first get started waterfowl hunting, don't think about. I was in that same boat. I grew up deer and turkey hunting and upland hunting, and then I got into waterfowl at a later age. And I always had this premonition of, oh, you got to hunt water. Obviously, waterfowl, got to be water. You're hunting wet ducks, they've got to be near water. some of the best hunts I've ever had, particularly for mallards, as well as some geese. I know we're focusing on duck today, but geese as well can be very productive if they are congregating and hitting some of these dry food sources like a cut cornfield or something to that extent. It doesn't even have to have any amount of water in it. They will still utilize that as an excellent food source. And across the Midwest, a very abundant. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you see a lot of feeding waterfowl hitting a very specific field, if you can get permission to hunt that field, you can have the hunt of a lifetime. Particularly if you could sneak in there the next day or the next 2 days before they kind of feed out of that field, because they will remove enough of the waste grain that they decide, okay, on to the next field. But private land access for hunting some of these dry crop fields can arguably be a lot easier than some of the other asking for permission, whether it's deer or turkey. Those are oftentimes difficult to get permission. A lot of farmers don't care if there's a bunch of mallards sitting in their cornfield. They're like, sure, go hunt it, be done tomorrow. You just get it for one day. So it's a great opportunity for access, and that's one of the really cool things about waterfowl is scouting. We're not sitting in the woods looking at every little acre. Oh, is that a deer track under there? Is that a deer track? A lot of it's just driving around and following natural flocks. And one thing I do want to highlight is I kind of talk about scouting a little bit. When I first started waterfowl hunting, I'll be honest, when I scouted, I focused on the biggest flocks. I was like, that's obvious. That makes sense to me logically. I see a big group of ducks. I probably want to see where that big group of ducks is going. But what I found is that's not necessarily the most advantageous spot. It's a lot more eyes, and I find it very difficult to hunt places where you have a big swath of birds coming in at one time. What I really prefer is if I can find a spot where I have a group of 5 or 6 birds coming in, and then 10, 15 minutes later, another small group comes in and another small group. And so I have shifted a lot of my scouting where I'm out there just driving around following these flocks. I now start to follow a lot more of the smaller groups. I think that lends itself a little bit more to a productive hunt, but also shows me some of these areas where birds are just constantly coming to feed. So when you're out scouting, don't focus on just those big, huge flocks of a couple hundred birds. Some of those little flocks that may hold a dozen birds can be quite worth following and seeing where they're going. Another kind of waterfowl use area that you're going to find. So we had these kind of habitat types, right? We have emergent wetlands, we have bottomland hardwoods, we have cut cornfields, and then we have open water. Now we have a couple different types of use. So this isn't necessarily habitat types, but this is what are the waterfowl doing while they're in those habitat types. And so one of these is going to be feeding areas, right? Obviously, every animal needs to feed to live. Waterfowl are no exception. They are extremely reliant on their caloric intake. They're flying a long distance. They're burning a lot of calories, and they need a high quality food source. So feeding is one of the behaviors they're going to be engaged in most of the time you're hunting them, whether it's in the morning and they're hitting that kind of early food source, whether it's in the afternoon and you're trying to hit on some of that loafing behavior, or maybe in the evening as they're hitting that last food source before bed and then going to roost. But we have a bunch of different feeding areas. Again, all the habitat types we mentioned can be utilized as feeding, but just kind of keep that in mind. Another really common, and I think this is one that a lot of hunters kind of forget about, myself included, is roost and refuge areas. So where are these birds sleeping, essentially? Now, when if you are able to find an active roost or find an area where these ducks are actually roosting, I personally will never hunt over a roost. And it's not some ethical decision that I make. Obviously there are some ethics involved there, but for me what's more important is I can have one great hunt. If I hunt that roost, I can have one of the best days I've probably ever had. I can see a bunch of birds. I may be able to get my limit, but I get that one time before I blow that roost up and they're gone. And now I'm kind of starting back from square one. What I prefer, if I can find a roost area or area where these birds are sleeping and spending time, I'll sit on that roost and watch where they go in the morning, where they leave, where are they going to feed directly after they leave the roost. That's where I want to be, is where they're going to feed. Not necessarily at that roost, because I want to leave that roost intact. I want it to be undisturbed, and I want them to have this sanctuary that they can keep going back to and relaxing and digesting their food, doing what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. Where if we blow that roost out, well, now those birds may go 10, 15 miles south, and you're pretty much out of luck, and now you have to start your scouting back at square one. So if you do find a roost, avoid hunting them, but utilize that information as much as possible. Now, I did kind of mention, excuse me, sorry, I need to take a quick drink. I did mention that this concept of loafing areas a little bit. And so again, this is an area, typically it's going to be in big open water, although you can occasionally see this behavior still happening in shallower bodies of water, but typically they kind of use that bigger open water because it allows a little bit more security and predator avoidance that some of these smaller bodies of water don't necessarily offer the ducks. So on warm, sunny days, they're just kind of out there doing their own thing, relaxing, digesting food, preening, cleaning themselves. And what you're likely going to see is this I have noticed in Illinois, particularly this behavior lasts from about 10:30 to around 1 or 2 is generally when you're going to see them loafing. It can be difficult to hunt loafing birds, particularly because again they're using those big, expansive, open bodies of water to avoid being near or near anywhere they could get hurt, essentially. But knowing where these loafing areas are, because the way a duck is going to spend its day, essentially it's going to be roosted overnight. It's going to leave that roost right before sunrise or right at kind of first light. It's going to take flight and it's probably going to head to the first feeding area that it feels safe in. After that feeding area, then they're going to leave to go loaf. Then they may loaf for a few hours. Then they're going to go in reverse, hit another food source before bed, and then go back to roost. So that's kind of what a typical day looks like. Obviously, it's a lot more nuanced than that. That's just kind of put things into perspective. But these loafing areas are really key if you're trying to figure out kind of that midday activity, or if you're focused on doing an evening hunt. You don't have that roost in your back pocket that you can say, okay, I know they're leaving from a roost to feed. Well, now in kind of an afternoon or evening hunt, you can kind of view this loafing area essentially as your roost, because you're going to want to identify that loafing area, identify where they're doing their evening feeding, and try to catch them either going in between and trying to call them instead of going to that feeding area, trying to call them to get to come in here, or what works 100 times better if you're lucky enough to make it happen is to go hunt that feeding area. If you can get permission or hunt an active feeding site, you're going to be in a really good spot, and you're going to have quite a bit of opportunity for success. But before we get too far along, strategic approaches, I did mention this concept of dabbler ducks versus diving ducks, and a lot of this is really going to differentiate how you hunt ducks, where you're hunting, and kind of what decoys and what tactics you're using. So ducks can essentially be broken into two groups. On the left here, we have a nice picture of your standard male mallard. So this is a Drake mallard. On the right, we have a scaup. This is a diving duck. Now, what I really want to point out in these two pictures is look at the kind of size of the birds, and not necessarily the size of the bird itself, but really the size of the wings and that wing ratio to body size ratio. As you can see on the mallard here on the left, the Drake mallard, those wings are huge compared to his body size. Where if you look at the scaup, they're very, very short and very small compared to his body size. And a lot of this is just due to the way they fly, and more importantly, the way they take off and begin their flight. So dabbling ducks, essentially, if you're new to ducks and new to waterfowl, the term dabbling essentially means surface feeding. And I'll quickly show a picture real quick. This is essentially what a mallard looks like when it's feeding. This is a prime example of a dabbling duck that is in fact dabbling. And so you can see he doesn't go completely underneath the water, right? He's just essentially tipping down, and his big old fat butt is just kind of sticking right up above the water. And that is a telltale sign that it is, in fact, a dabbling duck, where a diving duck will go completely under the water, go deep down in the water completely for 15, 20 seconds in some cases, where a dabbling duck's just going to really quickly tilt down, reach that shallow vegetation, and then come back up. And so you can see A dabbling duck or a mallard is not going to do very well trying to feed in 18 feet of water. So that's why they really prefer these shallow bodies of water, which is why a lot of people, instead of dabbling ducks, just call them puddle ducks. It kind of makes it a little bit easier to think of it that way. These ducks, they like puddles, they like shallow, small bodies of water. Now, they're primarily feeding on seeds and on insects. Um, but the easiest way to be able to tell the difference between a dabbling duck and a diving duck is the way that it takes off from the water. A puddle duck or a dabbling duck, like your mallard here, can literally be sitting on the water and just go straight up. It can just do a couple flaps and take off. A diving duck has to get that what most people think of a duck taking off from water, that running start, and then it takes flight. Diving ducks have to do that, where dabbling ducks can just take off, be sitting on the water, and just and go. Diving ducks have to take a running start. And so if you're off in the distance and you see some ducks, feeding out in the middle of the field, boom, they take off from the water, you instantly know, is that a dabbling duck or a diving duck? And that can, again, really help you plan your hunt. If you're sitting out there and all of a sudden you see, 15 ducks take off and they all start running on the water, then you probably don't necessarily want to go hunt the shallow back of the cove. Maybe you want to hunt out on the point and some of the deeper body of water. So it is important to be able to understand the distinction between the two. But that biggest distinction is going to be how they take off from the water. So obviously, diving ducks, like their name implies, they dive for food. They have the complete ability to go completely underwater and spend substantial time down there as they're feeding on fish, invertebrates, and other kind of deep water plants. So this is kind of what it looks like, and you can even see here this top one. It looks like there's a little bit of jewelry or a little bit of duck bands on a few of these, but pretty cool pictures. So that's kind of what it looks like when a duck is completely submerged underwater. And this is just a quick list of common duck species in Illinois and whether or not they're a dabbler and a puddle duck or a diving duck. We do have an old webinar on our YouTube channel. We'll probably hold another one here in the next month or two on waterfowl ID, where we go through every single one of these species, talk about them, show pictures, talk about what makes them unique, what makes them easy to identify, go over their vocalizations. So if you're new to this and you want to look and try to understand the differences between these species, you can look through our YouTube channel and find that waterfowl ID webinar, or just wait a few weeks and we'll likely have a new one coming down the pipeline here pretty quick. I will ask, just to kind of get Curtis involved here. Curtis, what's your favorite species to eat? I know you're a big duck hunter, and I know you love to eat wild game. If you had to pick one off this list, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm really bad at picking favorites of everything, but I could pick a couple. One I would definitely say is canvasback, and that's because it's rare. Not something I generally hunt marshes, so not a duck that I get access to very often. And canvasbacks back in the market hunting days used to fetch the highest price. It's a big bird, and they're known to be good. They're usually fattened up on wild celery and shoal grass and underwater vegetation, and yeah. So that one, I think the rarity makes it better. But I really like teal as one of the most tender ducks.
Ah,
There's some different things you can do with teal, especially like green wing teal. Really good for like making pates and dips and stuff
oh
like that.
yeah.
And then wood duck and pintail are two of my favorites for different reason. I feel like pintails are the most beefy of the ducks. They taste the most like beef, if that makes sense. And wood ducks are just a good duck, and the legs too. The legs are even like little mini chicken legs on a wood duck. So pretty cool. Those, yeah. So that's not one, but that's my favorite. What is that, four?
I like it. I like it. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about decoys now. One thing I do want to discuss before Curtis and I kind of move back and forth through this present or through this section. You don't need to spend as much as the industry wants you to think that you need to spend. I know when I first started getting into duck hunting, I fell into the trap of I have to have every gadget that's out there. I've got to have the highest quality decoy out there. in reality, duck hunting has been a North American tradition for a long time. Now, obviously, there are some issues with the late 1800s and when we had market hunting and where we drastically reduced this population. But throughout the early 1900s, when people were duck hunting, they were just using little blocks of canvas that they may try to add a little bit of color to, and they were still productive. So, in a lot of cases, the specific decoy and the brand and all this that you utilize is not as important as where you're hunting, what your decoy spread looks like, and your calling. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. You don't have to have everything we touch on. You don't have to have the top of the line that everything we touch on. I know me personally, I have 16 mallard decoys, and usually I'll take that and one mojo decoy, which we'll talk about so you'll kind of understand what that term is in a little bit. And that's really about all I take. I do have some field decoys and other things I may take if I'm feeling froggy, but a lot of times I like to be as minimal as I can, especially I hunt public land. I know Curtis does too. We don't have private land access. And so in a lot of cases, you may be walking a quarter mile, half mile. And if you're trying to carry 3 dozen decoys with you, that can certainly wear you out. So you don't have to have a ton of decoys. What I mentioned, and I'm a big proponent of, especially if you're just getting in to waterfowl hunting, is to just start with a dozen mallard decoys. You can pick up literally a dozen mallard decoys brand new for about $50 for your kind of standard typical decoy. If you want to get more high end, like the Avian X that have these UV paints and all these different whatever they come up with to justify their price tag, you may spend $300 on a dozen. So there's really that big distinction. But what I'm a big fan of is looking on Facebook, looking on Craigslist, looking at all these different marketplaces. There's a lot of people who get into waterfowl hunting and get right out of it. There's also a lot of people who get into waterfowl hunting and they have a very hefty wallet and like to get new decoys every year, every few years. And so I've really started to build my waterfowl hunting collection through some of these marketplaces where I can get used decoys at a decent price, not have to worry about too much. And occasionally you may have to touch up some paint with a Sharpie or a little bit of spray paint. Not the end of the world. But I just wanted to mention a few considerations before we get too much further. So this is kind of your standard decoy. This is what we call a floating decoy. Before we get into decoys, placements and spreads, I just wanted to go over some basics so you understand the terminology that we kind of use as we go through these. But this is kind of your standard floating decoy. You can see it's got this keel here at the bottom. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around on the screen there, but it's got this black keel that essentially allows it to stay upright on the water. And if you notice, it's got these kind of circular holes throughout the decoy. That is essentially to allow you to attach a decoy rig, which means a cable or some kind of string attached to a big weight at the bottom that essentially just keeps that decoy in place so it doesn't blow down the river or blow down the lake when the wind comes in. I will caution, I have been guilty of this myself. I've gone into new areas hunting and I've had too short of decoy weights to where my weight was literally just dangling, still a few inches off the ground, and all my decoys just started to blow. So, just word of caution, if you're getting into waterfowl hunting, just make sure you're matching the depth of the water that you plan on hunting with the depth of that decoy rig, just to ensure that it's actually getting traction and getting in the ground so you don't lose all your spinning or all your expensive decoys. Next type is a full body decoy. These are primarily used on dry ground or on field hunting. You'll see this a lot with goose hunters. I personally do have a few full body ducks that if, like I mentioned earlier, if I happen to find an area that has some dry feeding waterfowl that I can at least get in there and get some kind of decoy spread set up and try to target those birds. So full bodies are really good. They are expensive. And my biggest issue with them is they take up a ton of space, especially if you get into Canada goose like you see here. Those are big freaking decoys and they take up a lot of space. And yeah, so just kind of keep that in mind that space is also a concern with decoys. But what I'm a bigger fan of for some of these dry hunting spots, whether it's ducks or geese, are these shell decoys. And the nice thing about these shell decoys is, as you can see, they're kind of hollow on the inside. So they really just stack like Tupperwares. The head and neck is removable with one twist. It pops off, and those decoys just kind of sit right on top of each other like a Russian nesting doll or like your Tupperware. And so it's really easy to carry those into your spread, but also pretty easy to store without too much issue. Now, I will say full body decoys are crazy expensive, like prohibitively expensive in some cases. Where shells are often a lot cheaper. I know I bought some new goose shells last year. I think I paid $50 for 6 of them. Where if you're looking at full body, you may spend 180 on 4 decoys. So just kind of keep that in mind. Again, you can spend as much as you want. I like the shells because they're cheap, they work, and they store easy, and they're lightweight and easy to transport. Another alternative is windsock decoys. So these are again primarily used in dry hunting scenarios, and where they're really beneficial is for some of these species that require a ton of decoys. I would not necessarily use a windsock for a duck hunt, but I did just want to bring them out because they do make windsocks for ducks. These are primarily used for snow goose hunting. This, in fact, the image you see here is a snow goose decoy windsock. And the big advantage there is for snow geese, you may need literally thousands of decoys to have a realistic spread because that's just naturally how these birds flock up. Snow geese flock up in flocks of 10, 15, 20,000. And if you don't have a spread that looks like that, it looks weird and just isn't productive. For ducks, that's not necessarily an issue. Again, I take about a dozen decoys with me. In some cases, maybe 18 if I'm feeling froggy. So these are an option, but not necessarily for duck hunting just because the real benefit is you can get thousands or hundreds of them for fairly cheap. Where with duck hunting, we're not necessarily concerned about trying to get hundreds or thousands of decoys. And last but not least, we have the wonderful spinning wing decoy. You probably heard me use the term mojo earlier. This is what most people think of when they hear the term mojo. The decoy type is a spinning wing decoy, but the first company who kind of ran the market with it was Mojo. So a lot of hunters just kind of colloquially call them all Mojos and just kind of stick with that. But these can be battery operated or wind operated. Now, me personally, I don't necessarily see the benefit of a wind operated, and we'll kind of get into why a little bit later. But essentially, the whole point of a mojo is to add movement to your spread, especially in days where you have no wind, because wind naturally moves these decoys around. It makes them look like they're swimming and moving. And if it's a very calm day, it looks weird with just a bunch of ducks just sitting there not moving. So I use the battery operated because, again, I'm using that mojo for days where I need to add a little bit of movement to my spread because there's not any wind. So I don't necessarily see the point of a wind operated spinning wing decoy because I'm not going to use it on windy days because I'm not going to need it. But these are really productive when they first came out on the market. When they first hit the market, probably a decade and a half, 2 decades ago, every single person who had them in their duck spread was seeing more ducks, was having more ducks interact. But now that they've been on the market for a while, literally every hunter has one, two. We were at Clinton Lake last year hunting across the lake from somebody who had like 4 or 5 of them out. So everybody's starting to put these in their decoy spreads for the past decade. And so they're not as productive as they used to be. And I have actually stopped. I used to use one every time I went out, right? Now, like I just said a few minutes ago, now I really only use them when it's a very calm day and I need, a little bit of movement that I'm not getting from the wind. That's when I use them now. Where historically, I would literally, every time I duck hunt, I have at least one out. But I had started to notice it looks like birds were starting to flare off it. And you'll know as you start duck hunting, the term flare essentially means they're coming in. It looks like they're ready to land. You're going to get your shot, but for some reason they see something last minute or hear something that they don't like and they flare off and go in the other direction. And in my thought process, I was like, it happens often on the side where the mojo was. I moved the mojo and the next 2 flocks started flying perfect. And so I have really just started putting it away and really only using it on those calm days where I just need to add a little bit of movement to the spread because a very stagnant spread does not look realistic at all. And these can just add a little bit of movement. If you've had success with these for years and you put 4 or 5 out every time you go, more power to you. I just can't. Not for me. Not for me. I don't necessarily want to carry 5 or 6 of them around and all that stuff.
Yeah, one thing I do want to throw in there is I'm the opposite. I'm very selective when I use them, but I do like windy days. But it's for the same reason. I feel like ducks flare on them more on calm days. Um, just my personal thing may not be real, but I like my main thing is I want it to be sunny. If it's a cloudy day and I don't get that white flash, I feel like, yeah, there's no reason bringing them out there. But if
Sure,
it's sunny
sure.
day and enough wind to kind of disguise the noise and the wobble and all that, that's kind of my favorite time to use it. But
And that's the fun thing
everybody
about
does it
duck hunting.
different.
Yeah, you can talk to literally a dozen duck hunters, and everybody's going to have a little bit different way of doing things, and that's what makes it fun. The last decoy type, again, not very commonly used during duck hunting, but they do make duck versions, so I kind of wanted to throw it in here. This is essentially a decoy flag, and again, similar to a mojo, it just adds that layer of movement into your spread. Now, if you're out in a goose field and you're doing this, you're not using this as those birds are coming in. You're really using this to get their first attention when they're still hundreds of yards off in the distance, and you just kind of see them flying. You start hitting your call, and you just instantly hit that flag, make it look like a goose is coming in to land, and then put that flag away. It's really just to capture that first look and get their attention, and then you let the rest of the decoys and your calling kind of do the work from there. Another really common one, and one I think is picking up steam more and more, is a confidence decoy. So this is a decoy that's generally not the species you're targeting. So it's not a duck or goose. But what it is it just adds another bird that is common in wetlands. And so it adds a little bit more realism to the entire scenario that you're trying to develop here with your hunting setup, with your decoy spreads. It can just add that next layer of realism if you're really struggling. I personally don't ever use a confidence decoy. Um, just not something I've necessarily found useful, but I would certainly give it a try. Um, Definitely something a lot of people utilize. And there's a few different options. One reason I really threw this in here is because, especially as a first time duck hunter, you may want to naturally gravitate towards this decoy bag here on the left. That's kind of enclosed. It looks a little fancier. It's got additional pockets for things. I will say they are, for one, a lot more expensive than kind of the bare bone mesh you see here on the right. But I am such a big fan of this one on the right. Just these cheap standard decoy mesh bags that you can buy at any sporting goods store for like 10, 15 bucks as opposed to spending, 70 or 80 on this nice contraption. What I really like about these mesh bags, wetlands stink. Your decoys are going to get smelly, get stinky, get nasty, be covered in moss, mud, and tons of water. And so I like to be able to let them air out. And I find a mesh bag like this airs out a lot quicker than one of these kind of fully enclosed bags. Also, when they start to freeze, you're going to be, especially if you're duck hunting, you're likely going to freeze a decoy bag. If it gets wet and it gets cold, they freeze up. These mesh bags are pretty easy to kind of tear apart and get into it if you need to. The more expensive ones, not so much. So again, multiple different versions, but I find the cheaper one actually to be my recommendation just because it's more breathable, allows those decoys to really air out so they don't get covered in too much mildew and things as they sit in your storage shed. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about decoy placement. I'll let Curtis kind of touch on why wind direction and sun are so critically important to how we set up with waterfowl.
Yeah, wind direction is for the birds and how they want to land. You know, birds want to land into the wind, same as an airplane. It's just it aerodynamically makes sense. So, and we'll show you a couple examples of decoy placements with the wind and how you'll use that. But wind direction is always the first thing when you get to your hunting spot. You know, do the old lick your finger and find out which way the wind's going and use that to orient your spread and then monitor that because if it changes, you likely need to change as well. And then sun is all having to do with what the birds can see. The hardest thing with ducks is fooling their eyes. And especially if you have a landing zone right out in front of you, you want them hopefully looking at the decoys, looking at the landing zone, not at you necessarily. Having the sun at your back really helps you to hide and it allows you to identify ducks, which we know with waterfowl, the limits vary not only by species but also by sex in the case of mallards. four mallards, only two can be female. So we really need to be able to see the ducks before we shoot, or we're going to have a tough time pulling that trigger and knowing that we're doing everything legally and by the book. Um, the next thing here, the landing zone that I already mentioned, you're going to use the wind direction basically to decide where that's going to be. And I like to have it where hopefully the ducks are landing not staring right at you, just again to try to help fool their eyes. And then, of course, you do have to consider your rigging. I like to rig most of my decoys up with about only 4 feet of cord because I'm always hunting in my waders. So if it's over that, it's over my waders. I shouldn't be there. But if you go hunting open water or something, don't just start chucking your decoys out because it'll be like Dan was talking about earlier, and you'll have to round them up. And on a windy day, rounding up a bunch of decoys not hitting the bottom, you might as well be trying to move bullfrogs in a wheelbarrow. It just doesn't work. It's not
And
gonna
that's
happen.
when all the ducks are going to come in too. Anyway,
Oh
you're going to
yeah,
be out there
just to
chasing your
watch
decoys,
you.
and here just comes
Yeah.
a flock.
Yeah, and they're gonna watch you and go back and tell all their buddies, like, "Oh, you'll never guess what I saw this hunter doing today."
Can
Chasing
safely eat
decoys
over
all over
there.
the lake.
Yeah, so kind of like we mentioned, when I first talked about decoys and a few considerations, it's not the number of decoys you have, it's how you use them and how you set up. And this is why I am especially for waterfowl. Everybody's got a park, a lake, something nearby that waterfowl quite regularly frequent. Go visit those areas. Watch how waterfowl naturally flock up in a body of water or in a field. Watch how they naturally move across that field as they kind of feed across it. In some cases, like snow geese, like I said, they'll flock up in 10,000 and they'll do what we call a frog jump, where this flock will be here and they'll just kind of leapfrog across the entire field, where other waterfowl species don't necessarily feed that way. And so watching and just looking at how different birds interact in their habitat, I think is critical. So if you are just driving around and you come across a cut cornfield that's got a couple hundred geese in it or a couple hundred mallards, if you have the time and you can safely pull over and just kind of observe and watch for a little bit, I highly recommend it. Because again,
Uh,
it's not how many decoys you have, it's how you use them. And how you use them, we'll give you some basic starting guidelines as we kind of go through the rest of this presentation. We have some diagrams of different decoy placements that are good starting points, but oftentimes, Curtis is probably the same way. I am constantly moving decoys and adjusting how my basic spread looks. Every time I go out, it's a little bit different. And a lot of that is just due to I've duck hunted quite a bit. I've watched waterfowl quite a bit. And so you start to understand, oh, there's this little patch of vegetation here. Maybe I should stick 4 or 5 together over there. Maybe just a pair, a male and a female. And now it looks like they're actively feeding. So just adding a little bit of layer of realism to this and understanding how waterfowl naturally feed and how they naturally kind of interact with each other is really, really important. Another thing that's important, and we touched on it a little bit with the mojos, is motion is extremely important in waterfowl hunting. If you're out there and you literally just have a stagnant body of water with decoys just sitting there that aren't moving, that aren't spinning, and they're literally just sitting there, it doesn't look real to the youngest bird out there. And so motion can be really important. And there are a few different ways to add motion to your spread. You can use jerk strings, which we'll go over, as well as a few other different techniques that aren't too expensive that can allow you to add a little bit of motion on some of those calmer days. But obviously, like Curtis was mentioning, wind is always extremely helpful. And this last bullet, I think, is extremely important and one I often overlook. When I first started, I still occasionally overlook it. That decoys are essentially blockers. If you fill up an entire pond of decoys and those ducks have nowhere to land, I mean, you're not really doing a whole lot. And sure, that may seem obvious, but what's also important is waterfowl don't like to land over other ducks. And so if they are forced to land, like there's decoys here and they're forced to fly over here to land, they don't like to do that. In fact, they may not come in because the only landing zone they have to now fly directly over other birds or your decoys. So kind of view these as blockers, and that'll make a little bit more sense as we kind of go through some of these illustrations. I'll kind of let Curtis start out here with this very basic kind of U diagram here. This is where most people start with their decoy or with their waterfowl experience. This is kind of the most basic of basic decoy spreads. So take it away, Curtis.
Yeah, and like Dan said, read every bird, and you have the ability to move this throughout the morning. So don't only pay attention to the wind, but pay attention to the birds. If they keep flaring when maybe they fly over that little chunk of birds to the right, and every time they get right over the top, they flare, that would be time to maybe move those decoys. So also, I think a big thing to remember is try to keep your decoys spread out. One thing that new hunters, I think, make the mistake, they try to put them real close. Because a lot of times when we're looking at waterfowl, they're disturbed. They do get close as a defense mechanism, but when they're naturally relaxed, they're very spread out. So keep your decoys spread out. But we see the winds coming right from their back. We're going to assume the sun is right at their back, and they have a really nice blind there, so they're not um, they're in the perfect spot. They can see the ducks are lit up by the sun in front of them, but when the ducks try to look at them in the blind, they're blinded by the sun, which is great. And they have a clear approach to that landing zone, which is a pocket without decoys. Because remember, decoys are blockers, and ducks will a lot of times flare when they're right over the top of decoys. So I love giving them an approach right upwind where they can fly right into the wind and not directly go over my decoys, but see them to make them feel nice and comfy cozy.
Nice. I like that blinded by the light. That brings back the, what was it, the Manfred Man, blinded by the light.
Yeah, the same
It's a good
catchy,
way to
catchy
remember it.
song. Catchy song, yeah.
And this is basically, like Curtis mentioned, if that wind shifts or if the wind is coming from a different direction than directly behind me, the real basic scenario is just to turn and reorient that U so that that pocket is now open to birds flying in.
Exactly. And a lot of times I almost prefer a crosswind than a wind right at my back because, for one thing, the one disadvantage is the one person on like the right hand side of the blind gets the best shooting. But you can keep swapping, you can keep swapping out if that's the case. But I love this because the ducks are landing and they're not even looking towards your blind at all. So to me, I feel a little bit safer in this scenario than even when the wind's right at my back. So both are really good, but yeah, that's the positive of the crosswind in my mind. The ducks aren't looking right in your face.
Yeah. Now, if you were to put a mojo in this scenario, where would you put it?
I would put it beyond the decoys because I when ducks land, they're naturally going to be drawn towards the spinning wing because it catches their eye as another duck that's landing, but they don't want to get too close to it. So I would put it beyond the decoys on the left hand side so the ducks try to land as close to the like center of that pocket as possible.
You're saying over here somewhere?
Oh, where your cursor is, I would go, yeah, that could be good, or I would even go down and be a little less obvious, more towards the bank. Because
Okay.
with my mojos, I really like to place them where they're not super obvious to ducks that are close. I want them more to maybe be a long range attractant. And one place I have been really successful with mojos is on windy days. If you get in a flooded, doesn't it's not even timber that has a mass that they can eat. It's just with some woods. It's a little bit of protection from the
Uh,
wind, and it can be hard for ducks to tell that it's flooded. But if you do have a couple mojos down there flashing, then they're like, "Oh, there's ducks down there. That must be a good spot."
sure. Oh, I
So
like that. I like that. And guess what? If the wind switches the other way, again, we just turn that U a little bit.
yeah,
And this is really kind of like Curtis mentioned. This is the foundation for the decoy spread. You can build it out as much as you want. If I was to want, maybe for whatever reason I decided this day I wanted to bring out 50 decoys and really fill the spread. You have all this room back here, and that's where I would personally be filling in those decoys, because again, you want to keep this landing zone in this pocket wide open, and so you can fill this whole back area with more decoys. Again, if you desire, not necessary, and sometimes may actually be a hindrance, especially if it's a very calm day. I prefer to use a little bit lower decoys than I would on a very brisk, windy day that's going to get a lot of movement into that spread.
Sometimes pressure too. I know we used to we'd be notorious for be hunting, and then at some point in the day somebody would go off with like three decoys and sit by themselves, and we started noticing that they always got ducks, and it wasn't because they were in a better spot, but it was because these ducks that were super pressured were used to seeing like 2 dozen and a mojo.
Sure.
So that's a hunter. But if they saw three, they're like, "Oh, yeah, there's a good spot. Let's soak in there." So we started doing that. We would hunt even four people, and we might only have six decoys out there. Now check your regs, because in some places in Illinois, there may be a minimum requirement of 12, which is a little
Stupid. Yeah.
draconian, but it is what it is. You got to be legal, so do watch that. But anyway, yeah, less can definitely be more, but also use the area. If you're hunting a giant lake, you might need to use a few more decoys just to be spotted, because on a huge body of water, if you've got just four golden eyes floating out in front of you, most of the ducks may not even see you.
Sure. And what I'm a big fan of is, let's say we have little pockets of vegetation, maybe just some, again, we're hunting, let's imagine we're in an emergent wetland, hunting puddle ducks, dabblers, very shallow water, and you have some vegetation that is, coming out of the water and showing itself. In those cases, I really like to work with those as much as I can, because those add, again, another little realistic flair to your spread. So maybe you just throw, one decoy at each, or maybe on this one, you put a male and a female, you put a pair together, using some of these little natural, like Curtis said, use the habitat that's there. If there are little dry spots or areas that look like they have some vegetation emerging, definitely worth thinking about, and worth maybe throwing a decoy at it or two, just to again add a little bit more realism to the overall scene that you're creating, because that's essentially what you're doing, is you're trying to paint a picture via the habitat that's there, using the calls that you'll be using, as well as the decoys in front of you. And you want to paint this scene that it is in fact a real wetland, that birds are actively feeding in it and actively using. And the more you can use each little piece of that puzzle, and oh, there's some food here, oh, it can really benefit you. Now, so these were kind of what we consider a standard duck spread for puddle ducks. Diving, you can also use it for diving ducks, although this next kind of basic diagram we'll show is really a basic diving setup. And this is, again, a little bit different, but you can still utilize a lot of the same concept. But one thing I really want to point out here is this term raft. If you've been on a big body of water, a big lake, and you just see what looks like a big giant log just floating across the lake, or just sitting on the water, and then you bring up an eye, you're like, oh, those are birds actually sitting there. So that's what diving ducks really like to do. And we kind of term that as a raft. And they essentially get in this decent sized flock out in the middle of the biggest body of water they can find, and they'll just sit there. And so we can try to mimic that with our decoy spread as much as possible, by trying to artificially kind of create this rafting effect on kind of the north, in this example, the north side of that kind of basic U shape. But you could still see we essentially have that basic U shape still playing itself out. And now I will say, obviously, it's a little simplified in these examples. I certainly wouldn't have them as interspaced and as easily identifiable as they are here, where they're all a couple the exact same distance from each other. I'll have a pocket that may have 2 feet between, try to make it look a little bit more realistic. These are just kind of simplified, but with this kind of raft that we're creating, that can really elicit that response for diving ducks, and can be a really good strategy. And oftentimes, if I'm hunting a body of water that sees both puddle ducks and diving ducks, what I might do is kind of use this standard U that we were kind of talking about, but maybe towards the end on one side or maybe both sides, I'll throw some diving decoys out just to again add that little bit of flair if I think there are diving ducks in the area. Curtis, I know you've hunted diving ducks quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts here?
Well, one thing I'll say is it's a different kind of decoy usually because you're dealing with deeper water, and one of the reasons why I like to throw out like a string of decoys, you can almost make them like a trot line, but you can just
Hmm.
use one big weight and then just keep going out line, and every few feet you've got a decoy, and then you either anchor the other end or tie it to your boat or blind or something like that. But it makes it real easy where you don't have to have, let's say, like 2 dozen decoys with 12 foot of cord or
Yeah.
whatever depth the water is. So another thing to definitely think about there. Um, but yeah, the one thing should mention is the worst wind possible would be wind in your face. So you definitely never want to do that unless you absolutely have to. Maybe you drew a blind and that's the way you're going. We don't have a diagram to show that because you never want to set up that way. But if you do ever have to do that, realize that the ducks almost have to fly over you and land coming over your head. So really the only thing I found that works is putting all your decoys on the far side of the shooting range and like filling up the far side of the pocket, so the only place to
Ah,
land is between you and the pocket. It still sucks because they're going to be right flying over you, so there's a super easy chance for them to spot you. And when it comes to mallards, they don't just circle once. Usually
oh
it's
God,
five,
yeah.
7, 10 times, and that gives every single bird there 10 different opportunities to see everybody in your blind. So not easy with the wind coming, coming right at you, but it can be done in a pinch.
Nice. And just to kind of give some visualization of what Curtis is talking about when he said mallard circle, maybe a dozen times. Essentially, the way waterfowl typically works is when you're hunting ducks, again, you have your spread out. You may see those ducks a couple hundred yards in the distance. You may hit a few calls trying to get their attention, and then hopefully they'll come into your decoy spread and try to land. But oftentimes, especially with mallards, like Curtis said, they will sit there and circle and circle and circle above you, and they'll change elevation. They may be circling up high, and then the next flight they come down halfway, and then they may go back up and then down, and that allows them to visually see. That's what they're doing, is they're really checking out this entire scene to make sure it looks safe to land and looks realistic. And oftentimes that's when a lot of things can go wrong in a duck hunt, because they can catch you doing this. If you do that to try to look up at them and see what that circle looks like, you're screwed, and they're probably going to flare off. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I wanted to just give some kind of visualization of what he kind of termed their circling, if you've never been a part of a duck hunt. And this kind of actually lends pretty well to kind of follow along Curtis's comment there with, the way he likes to hunt in some of these deeper bodies of water is to have all the decoys essentially tied to themselves and tied to each other. So you just have one long string with a bunch of decoys on it. And we can kind of use that as a jerk string. This is a common technique that you'll see a multitude of different hunters utilize in their duck hunt. For one, it's cheap, and two, it's extremely effective if used properly. You can either DIY it. I don't necessarily recommend buying a rig. They're a little bit overpriced for what they essentially are, is just a string with a weight on the end. But essentially, what it allows you to do is when you first see that flock way off in the distance, you can give that jerk string a little bit of tug, and that's going to create ripples through the water that impact all of your other decoys. Even those decoys that aren't attached to the jerk string, they're still going to get some movement coming through from that water that's kind of moving across the others. Now, what you want to avoid is having a brightly colored string. Don't use blaze orange or a bright neon green string. You want it to be fairly camouflaged, again, kind of basic. But another thing is you don't want it too reflective, and you don't want it to float on the water. I've seen some people use some of the basic paracord that can actually float, and it looks a little bit wonky. And so I like to use a string that actually does sink itself a little bit in the water. It doesn't have to go all the way down, but at least conceal itself. And again, it just allows you to be sitting in your blind or sitting wherever you're sit. The ducks are off in the distance. Give that thing a little tug. Start your calling, and I'll occasionally I may need to move it a little bit more if I see those ducks start to turn and kind of show me their back. I may give it a little bit more movement just to, so by the time they turn around, there's still some movement happening. So again, this is a really easy technique and strategy to immediately implement in your waterfowl. If you've already got decoys, you can rig up 3 or 4 of them. I know some people rig up, have a jerk string of 15. You don't need all that. I personally like to go, 4 to 5. I think is a pretty sufficient number for where I hunt, particularly for dabbling ducks. But these are a really effective technique to just again add a little bit of movement to that spread, make it look a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, it's my favorite way to add motion. I think it's the best way because you can it's not just mechanical like everything
Right.
else out there. You can do it when you want. Just the main thing is making some kind of system that keeps your string underwater. So I do like to have something I can poke down in the mud close to the blind with an eyelet way down low, and that keeps the string down so that I'm not, so that string isn't visible up in the water. But yeah, I love the jerk string for sure.
Yeah, and it's fun to use. It's fun to just give a big tug on it and watch all the decoys move. And if you've got a kid in the blind, perfect job for them.
Yeah, it gives somebody something to do, That's the fun thing about duck hunting. You might have one or two people calling. Maybe somebody's job is to jiggle the jerk string, and maybe somebody's job is to push open the door of the blind. Who knows? But everybody's got their little thing to do. It all comes
Yep,
together to get the job
got to
done
have a
like
camp
Captain
chef too.
Planet. Ooh, that would be nice. Yeah, we didn't usually have that luxury walk-in hunting in Missouri, but
Yeah.
it would be good someday.
Obviously, again, I've kind of hit on this quite a bit, so I won't spend too much time here. But again, this is your basic spinning wing decoy, or what most people call a mojo. We've kind of beat on the dead horse here, so we'll just kind of quickly move
I
through
do
that.
like
Oh,
remotes for those, or
good
if
point.
you
Yeah,
don't have remotes, intermittent setting, so it's not just always going. It's like I mentioned, I like to tuck mine in the brush if I can, so they're not visible to ducks that are already real close and landing. I also really like to, yeah, if you have a remote, just turn them off when the ducks are getting real close, or if not the remote, then intermittent is the next best thing. They go for a while and turn off, go for a while, turn off. I think they look much more realistic that way than just constantly going.
sure. And this is probably my least favorite and one I don't necessarily recommend. They do have some that are a little bit better, but when these first hit the market, this is essentially what you saw. And essentially, they just have kind of a shaker type thing inside of the decoy that runs off battery. You turn it on, you throw the decoy in the water, and it just kind of sits there and shimmers. But what it does is it creates these hideous concentric rings. They do again have some that now have a big thing inside that like spins. It's kind of like a weight that kind of throws the distribution of the center of mass off, so it looks a little bit more realistic. But again, I recommend the jerk string over this. But if you're just looking to add something else, maybe you want to get a Christmas gift for somebody. These can be fun, but just try to get one that doesn't just create these very unified, uniform concentric rings because that stands out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, I never found them to be effective when I had them. We tried to use them sometimes, but either they make a little bit of noise. So if it's 100%
They do make noise.
completely
That's a good point.
calm,
Yeah,
then it's like we didn't want to use it. And then if there was just the slightest amount of wind, then it wasn't even noticeable. So
yeah, yeah,
yeah, I don't know. They've probably gotten better. This was a dozen years ago, so
yeah. Now
don't
they have
don't
ones that
hate it.
have basically like a miniature water pump inside, and it shoots water around to add more. So there's a million different gadgets and stuff out there.
Oh yeah, I've got one of the
Jerk string,
Mojo bilge pumps, but even those, like they're not as powerful. Like it may look good in somebody's bathtub, but when you get out on the marsh and there's a little bit of wind, you're almost like, is it on? Is it off?
right?
Disappointed in that too. I was at least.
Yeah, jerk string for the win. But now we'll talk a little bit about waterfowl calls and a couple different types, and then we'll hand it over to Curtis, and he'll do some demos for us and kind of talk through the process of calling a little bit. But I do want to talk about kind of the different types of calls, right? So we have kind of your standard acrylic call. The nice thing about duck calls, you can spend as little as you want or as much. You can go from handcrafted to form injected molds that you can get at Bass Pro for like $15. What I am a big fan of is not having too many calls. There's a lot of people who will come to a duck blind with like 8 or 9 different duck calls on their lanyard. I like to have about 3. You can see that's what I've got here on my lanyard. I've got the 6-in-1 whistle, which allows me to mimic some teal vocalizations, but also for dog commands. And then I've got a wooden duck call, and then just kind of your standard acrylic. I like to have 2 duck calls, particularly if I'm hunting a cold day, because they will freeze up inside. Obviously, you're blowing through it, so there is moisture from your breath getting inside of that reed, and it can gum up or freeze up. So I like to at least have another option on my call. So if this one ends up freezing on me and starts to squeak, I can immediately just go to this one. And what I a lot of times do, once I feel this start to freeze up, I'll just throw it inside my chest waders, get it against my body heat, and that'll loosen it up pretty quickly. A couple goose calls I'll just throw in because that's the nice thing about waterfowl. In a lot of cases, you don't know whether there's going to be ducks in the area. You may see some geese, so it may be worth throwing in a goose call. If you're looking into goose hunting, again, we're focused on duck today, but if you were to buy one call, I recommend the flute call. It's a lot easier to use for a beginner, where the short reed actually takes back pressure to make the vocalization. So you have to blow out and create back pressure, where the flute is kind of just like your standard flute. You just blow through it and it'll at least produce a sound. So if you're just getting started in a goose, flute is definitely a great starting point, because again, it's a little bit more user friendly, a little bit easier to get that first correct note out of, and then you can start building in your repertoire a little bit more. But back to duck vocalizations, I'll turn it over to Curtis.
Right, yeah. So your basic, everybody knows the quack, right? That's going to be the first thing that you want to actually practice or master if you want to call ducks. Basic vocalization. Remember, ducks don't only look different, male and female, but they actually sound different, male and female too. So this is a vocalization of a female. If you want to sound like a male of any species, that 6-in-1 whistle that Dan showed earlier, that would be what you would use. But now, first, how do you put the call to your lips? That's the first thing we should talk about. And it's just like if it was a bottle of craft beer or soda or anything like that. I like to just lay it on my bottom lip and tilt it up to your top, and then just Buck Gardner used to say, give it a little kiss. So purse your lips up so you make a good seal with the barrel of the call. All duck calls have 2 pieces. You're going to have a barrel, which is the big part that you blow into, and an insert, which will have the reed or reeds in there. Now, a tuning tip while I got this apart, the further you pull this reed out, the looser the call will be, and so the lower pitch it'll be, and then vice versa, it'll be a little more high pitch if you push it further into the insert. Put it back together. Now for a quack, I like to say the word quit. Quit. I've heard other people say the word quack. You can use whatever works for you. I say the word quit. And when blowing into the duck call, we want to use our diaphragm muscles. So if you're puffing your cheeks, you're doing it wrong. You should be like fogging a glass, or picture you're a quarterback coming up to the line. Hut, hut. That's coming from your diaphragm. Same thing into the call. And when I say quit using my diaphragm, it should sound something like this. And you can kind of experiment saying that different ways, sometimes really kind of enunciating the T at the end of quit, sometimes not. blowing air, different speeds. Just really learn that quack. Once you learn the quack, you can call ducks. That's the main thing you need to call ducks. So get that down and you're good to go. We can go on to this next slide is going to be a greeting call. So once you learn the quack, now you have to actually put it together into a cadence because while ducks will let out a single quack, most of the times it's going to be a series of quacks, and a greeting call is just that. So about 5 to 7 notes, a little bit descending, and it sounds a little bit something like this. So you can kind of vary that a little bit, but it's just the basic call of any female. Mallard or gadwalls sound the same. They're just a little coarser. Pintails have a quack. Teal have a quack that sounds like a mallard just sucked down a helium balloon. It's really cute. If you ever get to hear it, you'll know it. But yeah, get that quack down, and then to learn calling, it's just how you put together your quacks. So that's your basic greeting call. This next one on here is a hail call. And this is one I won't do because it might break my computer. I'll do a mini one, but now for a hail call, most people will just get the most sound they can out of a call. And I can get a little bit louder on this. This is actually not acrylic. This is just polycarbonate, a cheap plastic call, but it gets a little bit louder than my wood call, but I don't think it sounds as good. But some people will do 10, 12 notes in this, and it's something that a duck can't do. This is more like a duck is a long ways off and you're just trying to hopefully get its attention. A hail call. So I didn't even like do that loud, but you would ring that as loud as you can. And this is where the competition callers will say you got to make the call ring. You find that sweet spot in the quack because there's one place where you can really push it, and if you go too far, you're gonna squeak and not sound good. So anyway, hail call probably the least important call out of any of these. So
I never use it.
yeah, people ask about it, but honestly, yeah, hardly ever use it.
Yeah, and Curtis did bring up a good point that I kind of want to touch on before we go to the next one. If you are looking up vocalizations and looking, up YouTube videos on how to continue how to call, avoid competition calling style. There's kind of two types of waterfowl callers. There's the hunters, and then there's the competition callers. A lot of times they overlap, and the competition callers are hunters, but it's a very distinct type of calling. They aren't necessarily trying to sound the most realistic or trying to sound the most like a duck. Like Curtis said, they're trying to find that sweet spot in the call where they can get the most sound, get the longest breath. And so just kind of keep that in mind. If you are, looking to get into waterfowl calling, and after this, you go and try to find some tutorials, just try to find one that's kind of built around that hunting style or by a hunting company, not necessarily the competition style.
And even the competition callers, they don't call like that when they hunt ducks. You
Right,
can watch
right.
like Buck Gardner's early hunting videos. He was a world champion duck caller, but when he hunts ducks, he would just
Completely different.
yeah, do the basic cadence every once in a while, and not that often, because the biggest mistake people make is calling too much. Definitely, way more than the other way around. But everybody wants to do this, the feed call. You can even get the little shaker so somebody can shake it and it does the feed call. Um, People really like this because it's cool, it's neat because you can do it fast, and a lot of times this is what sets apart competition callers because at that level everybody can quack really good, everybody can do good cadences, but who can sound like the most ducks on the water and who can say ticka the fastest basically? Because
And I am not good at this call. I'll tell you that.
no,
I do not
it's
have a good
it's
feed
not
call.
needed at all.
Yep.
It's more for show. Like in disc golf, we say drive for show, putt for dough. I guess that's
I like it.
the
I like it.
equivalent here. But
Yeah.
anyway, so the word that I say in my feeding calls, I have two different ones. I have a slow one that's a tuk tuk, and that's a confidence call for me. And then my fast one is tick tick ticka 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 ticka, and every once in a while drawing out that into a quack. And you're really using your diaphragm on this, really pushing air through the call. And I used to practice this in high school without even a call. I would just be sitting in class going like ticka 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 ticka, trying to get really fast at that because it's something that the more you practice, the faster you get. So I'd be sitting in calculus just ticka 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 under my breath, all through high school. Sorry, Mr. Sipple, but anyway. So here's the slow feeding call that I use as a confidence. Just tuk tuk. And then if I add in the faster ticka ticka, it's supposed to sound like multiple ducks maybe feeding. Again, not a call you have to use, but here's the faster feeding call. I always start off with tuk tuk and then I'll get into ticka ticka. So yeah, that's just a basic feeding chuckle. Not one you have to know, but nice just to mix in, I guess, to make your calling sound various and to make your friends in your blind think you know how to call when you're playing with it. Lonesome Hen, this is a good call. So this is just a cadence that's kind of pleading and it's slow. So just slow down your cadence, try to put some feeling in it, and it's really just saying like, hey, come over here. This is a good spot.
Just singing some Barry Manilow.
It's just a real pleading type call. It sounds like a lonesome hen mallard sitting on the water. It's usually the first call that I start with is a lonesome hen quack like that.
Yeah, usually for me, it's probably the first one I use and also probably the last. I use it a lot to reassure ducks.
For sure, yeah, really good call, and just slowing it down like that, it breaks up your cadence and really seems to work.
Yeah.
The one
All
other
right.
call
Well,
that I
with
will throw in there
oh,
before we
yep.
go to upcoming events is a comeback call, and that's just getting really excited. So that's one other call I will use. And so I'll do, just so you can hear all three cadences together, I'll do first a lonesome hen, then I'll just do a normal greeting, and then a comeback call. So you see the difference, and that then you kind of know what people are talking about if you hear these terms. So comeback call will be the third one. Here's the lonesome hen. That was not it. That was a sneeze, Gesundheit. So the comeback's very fast. It's very getting on them. And that's a lot of times what I use if they're working all right, but now they start to land on the wrong side of my decoys. And I want that basically that hen to say, no, 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 not over there. That's not good. Over here. And so really get on them. And hopefully it's enough for they change their mind, come back and give you one more pass.
I do have a question. How do you work with other callers? Let's say, me and you are both in a blind and we're calling together. Are we trying to incorporate our calling together or just kind of doing our own thing and hoping it kind of meshes together?
Yeah, I mean, I've never worried about it too much. I just always make sure that like nobody's calling when the ducks are looking right at us. And so like I don't care what somebody does as long as they're not calling when the ducks are looking right at us and it's causing them to flare. Other than
Sure.
that, I've never really coordinated it or anything. I've just kind of done my thing, and if somebody else is a caller, they do it too, and together it probably sounds a little bit better, because you got more than one thing making noises. But again, don't call when they're looking right at you. That's way more important than whatever kind of sweet notes you can make on that thing.
100%. Perfect. Well, with that, that kind of concludes tonight's webinar. If you have any questions in the chat, we'll stick around for probably 5 minutes or so. If you've got any questions, drop them in the Q&A feature or the chat. We do have a couple upcoming events that we want to kind of highlight. Obviously, hunting season's underway, so kind of in a little bit of a dry spell for the most part. But this Thursday, if you're interested in deer hunting, we've got a rut hunting webinar where we're going to talk all rut strategies, all techniques, all different things that you can kind of utilize. So the next 2 to 3 weeks of your deer season are about as exciting as they could be, because rut is one of those things that, especially in the Midwest, we don't get a ton of really cool wildlife related behavior in some cases. This is one of the better ones, especially as a hunter. Being out in the woods during rut is a spectacle that's not worth missing. So if you're interested in taking that webinar, that's Thursday at 7 to 8:30, about the same time. Should be really good. And then Saturday, December 3rd. This is one we're really excited about. We're going to do kind of a trail camera overview workshop. We're actually going to go up a few weeks before the event, scout out the piece of property that we're going to be hosting the event at, set up a few trail cameras, monitor those, and then at the event, we're going to go back, pull those trail cameras, go through the photos, talk about why we picked that area, and now take the next step of, okay, I see what's in this area. Am I going to hunt this? If so, how? Or am I going to try to shift my efforts elsewhere? So it should be a really cool workshop where we're going to put a lot of these pieces together. So stick out for that. The current registration is not open for that, but we'll be here in probably the next week or two as we get a little bit of kind of the last minute details finalized. We also have a new podcast coming out this week. If you're new to the Learn to Hunt program, or haven't spent much time with us, we do have a podcast called Hunting Illinois that is bi-weekly. So we release it every other week. In this, especially during hunting season, we do what we call hunting reports. So we'll go over what we're seeing in the field, what we're hearing from other people, what the data shows us, what the weather looks like, what we can expect. So really just kind of give you a nice snapshot of what's happening out there and what to expect over the coming weeks as the seasons progress. But we're going to talk quite a bit about mountain lions and cougars. Obviously, they've been in the news in Illinois the past week or two. So we want to kind of talk about that story, share a little bit of our experiences and kind of discuss it. So look out for that coming out. We're going to record it tomorrow, so it'll probably be out on Thursday. But feel free to search for that on YouTube or through any of your podcasts, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Google. The show is called Hunting Illinois. Here's all of our social media channels. If you're brand new to us, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. YouTube, we do a lot of videos. In addition to these webinars, they all get uploaded there. Our podcasts get uploaded there. But we also do how-to videos and instructional videos that you can find there. And on Facebook and Instagram, that's kind of where we communicate all of our efforts, whether it's workshops, seminars, webinars, podcasts, or even just share important dates and reminders that are really important for Illinois hunters to keep in mind. So feel free to follow us there. But if you have any questions, like I said, we'll stick around for a few more minutes and answer those. If not, have a wonderful evening, and thanks for joining us tonight.
While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'll play a couple sounds for whoever's left. Here's what a male pintail sounds like. This is a call you hear a lot right now because there's a lot of pintails out there. I gotta turn my phone up. So that rolling whistle call, you can make that on the 6-in-1 whistle. Here's a widgeon, which is another call you can make on that. So that's one that really stands out. Then gadwall, this is one you'll hear a lot. Just the male beck call is what it sounds like a really shortened quack. Almost like a duck burping or something.
Cool birds. Completely different from their female counterparts.
For sure. And even with mallards, everybody knows the quack. That's what I was imitating. But here's what the male sounds like. That's courtship whistles. Let me see.
Yeah, you'll hear people call these drake whistles.
This is the whistle that you'll hear a lot. Oh, there's also a hen in there. That wasn't a great. But yeah, the Drake whistle kind of sounds like more like that than a quack. Yeah, I like that. You do it with a 6 and 1. That's one of the six right there. And a
Yep,
wood duck. Can you do that one?
I cannot do a wood duck on it.
A tweet, tweet. And then teal, which is just a short little whistle. Yeah, it looks like no question. So good luck, everybody. Hopefully, follow us on the socials if you're there. Talk to us, reach out there, let us know if you have any questions, need any help, or if you have any success. We'd definitely like to
Yeah,
hear
we'd love
that
to hear
too.
stories.
Or if you got a spot open in your duck and goose blind,
Yeah.
Matt and I, we have calls. We'll travel.
We'll travel with calls and decoys. I've even got an
Decoys,
extra pair of waders if you need them.
layout blinds, yeah, you name it. You get the spot. We got the equipment right here. Good to go.
All right. Well, perfect. Thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful evening and good luck and safe hunting.
See
Thank
you in
you.
the marsh.